I've mentioned the persistence of types, what Rossi calls typological permanence. But there's another dimension, another sort of temporality to type that we might call the anteriority of type. For it's not the case in Rossi's thinking that the type just continues, once it emerges, once it's manifest, that the type simply continues. The type for Rossi is already there before the design effort, before the actual construction, perhaps even before the architect's imagination of it, that the type pre-exists the architectural act. The best example of the anteriority of type comes in Rossi's explanation of what he means by the analogous city. And to make this explanation, he asks us to look at a painting by Canaletto of Venice. If you look at this painting, you'll see a building to the left of the painting. That's the corner of the Chiricati Palace of Andrea Palladio. If you look at the very center of the painting, is a project that Palladio made for the Rialto Bridge of Venice, but never actually executed. The Chiricati Palace is not in Venice, it's in Vicenza, as is the very large building on the right, which is Palladio's Basilica. Now, these projects are important. They have already various associations. The Basilica, for example, was really just a kind of large classical wrapper around an existing medieval building. What Palladio did was in the Basilica was sort of bring classicism into its urban form, its modern urban form. And in the Chiricati Palace, which is simply in a way a house, he also used the classical language in the same way to give the house a certain status. And all of these things would have been important to Rossi. I'll read Rossi's passage on this painting. To illustrate the concept of analogous city, I give the example of Canaletto's fantasy view of Venice, a capriccio in which Palladio's projects for the Ponte di Rialto, the Basilica of Venice, and the Palazzo Chiricati are set next to each other and described as if the painter were rendering an urban scene he had actually observed. These three Palladian monuments, none of which are actually in Venice, and one of which is a project, nevertheless constitute an analogous Venice, formed of specific elements associated with the history of both architecture and the city. The geographical transposition of the monuments within the painting constitutes a city that we recognize, even though it is a place of purely architectural references. This example enabled me to demonstrate how a logical, formal operation could be translated into both a design method and then into a hypothesis for a theory of architectural design in which the elements were pre-established and formally defined, but where the significance that sprung forth at the end of the operation was the authentic, unforeseen, and original meaning of the work. There's an epistemological claim made in this passage, the claim that architecture produces knowledge. The type, though it's pre-theoretical and pre-conceptual, nevertheless gives the form of social experience and collective understanding. The type sort of schematizes aesthetic experience, sensual encounters, in such a way that it can be scanned by the collective human understanding. A city, of course, is a social and material object in its own right. It's the most concrete of realities that architecture deals with. But for Rossi, the city is also an invisible, abstract, virtual reality. Every act of architecture can only come from the city, and every act of architecture returns to the city. We can imagine Rossi looking at this painting by Canaletto and saying, that is architecture, just as Los looked at the mound and said, that is architecture. But where is the that? It seems that for Rossi, architecture resides in a virtuality. It's this virtuality that he calls the analogous city. So as Rossi is making not only an epistemological claim that type produces social, experiential knowledge, he's also making an ontological claim. Architecture exists. It exists as a virtuality that is manifest in the form of type. You can imagine the ontological existing on a kind of vertical plane and history unfolding through time. And it's at the intersection of the ontological plane, this field of potential, this field of possibility. As it intersects historical time, we get the actualization of architecture at that intersection. But the ontological is folded into history from the start.